Johnny Carson was taping The Tonight Show in front of 400 people when a producer rushed onto the set with a message that would break his heart and change television history forever. An 8-year-old boy was dying. He had 3 weeks left, maybe less. And he had one request that seemed absolutely impossible. What this dying child asked for had never been done on national television. What Johnny promised shocked every executive at NBC. And what happened next became the most powerful moment in Tonight Show history. But America almost never saw it. The network tried to bury the footage. They said it was too risky, too emotional, too real. They were terrified it would destroy Johnny Carson's career and cost them millions in lost advertising. For 24 years, this story remained hidden, a secret moment of courage that only a few hundred people witnessed live, until someone found the footage deep in the NBC archives and forced the world to see what real bravery looks like. This is the story of David, a little boy who asked for one impossible promise, and the night Johnny Carson bet everything he'd built to keep it. It happened in 1978, the year Saturday Night Fever dominated the box office, the year 3 popes served in 1 year, the year America was still healing from Vietnam and Watergate, and the year an 8-year-old boy in Iowa taught 35 million people what it means to be truly alive, even when you're dying. But before we get to that moment, you need to understand what Johnny Carson was risking. Because this wasn't just a TV host being nice to a sick kid. This was a man putting his entire empire on the line, his reputation, his career, everything for one promise to one boy. If you want to see how this story ends, keep watching. And if this story moves you, hit that like button, drop a comment below, and subscribe so you never miss stories like this. Also, let me know in the comments where in the world are you watching this from. Now, let's go back to 1978 and see what was really at stake. In 1978, Johnny Carson wasn't just a talk show host. He was American television. Every single night, 30 million people tuned in to watch The Tonight Show. That's more viewers than the Super Bowl, more than the Oscars, more than the evening news. When Johnny told a joke, the entire country laughed together. When Johnny endorsed a product, stores sold out by morning. When Johnny made a comedian famous, their career was made. When Johnny destroyed a comedian with silence, their career was over. He had that much power. He was the gatekeeper, the king, the most influential entertainer in America. But Johnny Carson was also the most private man in show business. He never gave personal interviews. He never discussed his 3 failed marriages. He never talked about his son Ricky, who died in a car accident in 1991, but whose troubled life haunted Johnny for years. Johnny had built a fortress around his personal life. The Tonight Show was comedy and entertainment and escape. It was never supposed to be personal, never emotional, never vulnerable. That was the deal. America got to laugh with Johnny 5 nights a week, but they never got to see the real man behind the curtain. NBC protected this formula like it was the nuclear codes. The Tonight Show had rules. It was taped weeks in advance. Every segment was edited. Every joke was approved. Every guest was vetted by multiple levels of management. Nothing spontaneous ever made it to air. Nothing risky. Nothing that could hurt the brand or scare away advertisers who paid millions for 30-second commercial spots. The show was a machine generating money, and you didn't mess with the machine. This dying boy's request threatened all of it. It would require Johnny to break character on national television to show emotion, to be real, to let 30 million strangers see the man, not the performer. It would require NBC to air something they couldn't control, couldn't script, couldn't guarantee would be good television. Most dangerous of all, it might remind America that behind all the laughter, real people were suffering, real children were dying, real families were being torn apart by diseases that medicine couldn't cure, and nobody wanted to think about that at 11:30 at night. So when that message reached Johnny during a commercial break, he faced an impossible choice: protect everything he'd spent 16 years building, or risk it all for a dying child he'd never met. What would you have done? The commercial break was supposed to last 2 minutes. Fred de Cordova, Johnny's longtime producer, walked onto the set and handed Johnny a folded piece of paper. Johnny was adjusting his tie, getting ready for the next segment. He unfolded the note and read it. His face changed. The smile disappeared. His hands stopped moving. For a moment, Johnny Carson just stared at the words on that paper, like he was reading something in a foreign language. The message came from a woman named Margaret in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Her 8-year-old son, David, was dying of leukemia at University of Iowa hospitals. The doctors had tried everything: chemotherapy, radiation, experimental treatments that made David so sick he couldn't stand. Nothing worked. The cancer was winning. David had 3 weeks left. Maybe 2, maybe less. They were just keeping him comfortable now, waiting for the inevitable. But David had one dream before he died. He loved The Tonight Show, even from his hospital bed, even when the pain was unbearable and the nausea from chemotherapy made him vomit every hour. David watched Johnny Carson every single night. He'd laugh at the monologue even when laughing hurt. He'd smile at Carrick the Magnificent, even when he could barely keep his eyes open. The Tonight Show was David's escape from needles and hospital rooms and the terrifying knowledge that he was dying at 8 years old. David didn't want to meet Johnny Carson. He didn't want an autograph. He didn't want a phone call. David wanted to be on The Tonight Show. He wanted to sit in Ed McMahon's famous chair, the one right next to Johnny's desk. He wanted to wear a suit and tie like a professional. He wanted to do Ed's legendary introduction, the one every American knew by heart. He wanted to say, "Here's Johnny," just once before he died. He wanted America to see him as something other than a dying boy in a hospital bed. He wanted to feel important, normal, alive. NBC executives heard about the request and immediately said, "No, you can't put a dying child on national television. What if he's too sick? What if he can't perform? What if he breaks down crying on camera? What if America changes the channel? What if advertisers pull their money?" The risk was too great. The answer was absolutely no. Johnny Carson looked at Fred Cordova. He looked at the cameras and the studio audience and the empire he'd built on jokes and carefully controlled distance. Then Johnny did something he'd never done in 16 years as host. He made a decision without asking NBC for permission. He picked up the phone. He called Margaret in Cedar Rapids, and he said 6 words that would change everything. "Get David on a plane tomorrow." 2 days later, David arrived at NBC Studios. Margaret pushed him through the gates in a wheelchair. David was small for 8, wearing a baseball cap, pale and thin from 14 months of treatments, but his eyes were bright. Johnny met them in his dressing room. No cameras, no audience. Johnny knelt to wheelchair height and shook David's hand. "David, tonight you're my co-host. 30 million people will see you as I see you. Not as a sick kid, as a professional, as someone who matters. Can you do that?" David nodded, tears streaming. For the first time in 14 months, he felt like something other than his disease. Wardrobe made David a custom navy suit. They styled his hair and showed him Ed McMahon's chair. Then they taught him the introduction. David practiced "Here's Johnny" 20 times, 30 times. Crew members who'd worked television for 30 years wiped tears away. 2 hours before taping, NBC executives cornered Johnny. "We can't air this. Too risky. What if he collapses? We could lose millions. This could destroy your reputation." Johnny's expression turned cold. "David's going on. If NBC won't air it, I'll quit and take the footage to ABC." Johnny had just bet everything on an 8-year-old boy. Backstage, Johnny sat with David again. "You scared? A little? Me too. But when you say my name, 30 million people will see what I see. A brave kid, a fighter. Not someone to pity, someone to admire. Ready?" David straightened his tie. "I'm ready. Let's make history." The curtain opened. The announcer boomed. Tonight's special co-host, 8-year-old David from Cedar Rapids, Iowa. David sat in Ed's chair, tiny in his navy suit. He looked at the camera. "Here's Johnny." The audience exploded, not with pity, with genuine respect. Johnny walked through that curtain with tears forming. He shook David's hand. "Thank you for that introduction, David." "Perfect." The studio audience rose to their feet. For 8 minutes, Johnny conducted the show with David beside him. He asked about Iowa, about being 8. David answered with wit, making jokes that landed. The audience laughed. Real laughter. For those 8 minutes, David wasn't dying. He was just a kid talking to Johnny Carson. As the segment ended, Johnny lifted David into his arms. This man who never showed emotion held a dying child on live television. Johnny's voice cracked. "David, you did something very special tonight. Thank you." David whispered so only Johnny heard, "Thank you for keeping your promise." Johnny carried David off stage as the audience stood in silence crying. America had just witnessed something unforgettable. But what they didn't know was that Johnny's promise was far from over. Johnny walked through that curtain with tears forming. He shook David's hand like greeting a colleague. "Thank you for that introduction, David. Perfect." The studio audience rose to their feet. For 8 minutes, Johnny conducted the show with David beside him. He asked about Iowa, about being 8. David answered with wit, making jokes that landed. The audience laughed real laughter. For those 8 minutes, David wasn't dying. He was just a funny kid talking to Johnny Carson. As the segment ended, Johnny lifted David into his arms. This man who never showed emotion held a dying child on live television. Johnny's voice cracked. "David, you did something very special tonight. Thank you." David whispered so only Johnny heard, "Thank you for keeping your promise." Johnny carried David off stage as the audience stood in silence crying. America had just witnessed something they'd never forget. The NBC executives who feared the segment would destroy ratings were stunned by what happened next. The episode with David didn't just do well, it broke every record The Tonight Show had ever set. 35 million people tuned in that night, 5 million more than usual. But what happened after the show aired was even more incredible. People started recording the episode on their VCRs and sharing the tapes. Remember, this was 1978. There was no internet, no YouTube, no social media. But somehow, that 8-minute segment with David spread across America like wildfire. Schools showed it to students during assemblies. Churches screened it for their congregations. Hospitals played it for sick children. Libraries kept copies for anyone who wanted to see it. That one segment became the most watched Tonight Show moment of the entire decade. NBC's phone lines completely crashed from the volume of calls. Every single caller said the same thing. "Thank you for showing us David." Within 48 hours, NBC studios received over 50,000 letters addressed to David. They came from children with cancer who said watching David gave them hope. From parents of sick children who finally had a way to explain that their kids still mattered, still had value, still deserved to be seen. From healthy people who said David made them appreciate their own lives. From Vietnam veterans who said they'd seen combat, but cried watching an 8-year-old boy be that brave. The letters came from every state, from every background, all saying the same thing. David changed us. But what America didn't know was that Johnny Carson wasn't done keeping his promise. Johnny flew to Cedar Rapids 3 more times in the following 2 weeks. No cameras, no publicity, no press releases. He would arrive at University of Iowa hospitals after midnight, so no one would recognize him. He'd sit by David's bedside for hours, bringing gifts, telling jokes, sometimes just holding the boy's hand when David was too sick to talk. The hospital staff later said Johnny would stay until dawn, then fly back to Los Angeles in time to tape that night's show. About these visits, they were private, sacred. 2 weeks after David's appearance on The Tonight Show, Margaret called Johnny with the news he'd been dreading. David was declining rapidly. The leukemia was winning. David could barely stay awake. The end was coming. Johnny flew to Cedar Rapids that same night. He sat with David in the ICU. David was barely conscious, but when he heard Johnny's voice, his eyes opened. "Did I do good?" David whispered. Johnny Carson, the man who made 30 million people laugh every night, broke down crying. "You were perfect," Johnny said through tears. "You were the best co-host I ever had." David smiled. It took all his strength, but he smiled. "Tell America thank you for watching me," David whispered. Those were the last coherent words David ever spoke. He slipped into unconsciousness that night. 2 days later, on October 19th, 1978, David passed away. He was 8 years old. He'd been fighting leukemia for 14 months. But for 8 minutes on national television, David had been fully, completely beautifully alive, and 35 million people witnessed it. Johnny Carson attended David's funeral in Cedar Rapids. He sat in the back row wearing sunglasses, trying not to be recognized. He didn't speak at the service. He didn't make it about himself. But before they closed the casket, Margaret asked Johnny if he wanted to see David one last time. Johnny walked to the front of the funeral home. David was wearing the navy blue suit from The Tonight Show. In his small hands, Margaret had placed a photograph of David and Johnny together backstage, both of them smiling. Johnny touched David's hand. He whispered something no one else could hear. Then he walked out and flew back to Los Angeles. The next night, Johnny Carson hosted The Tonight Show like nothing had happened. He told jokes. He interviewed celebrities. Nobody watching had any idea he'd just buried an 8-year-old boy. His staff later said Johnny never mentioned David's name again, never talked about the hospital visits, never referenced the Tonight Show appearance unless someone directly asked him about it. Johnny had rebuilt the wall between his public persona and his private pain, and he wasn't going to tear it down, even for grief. NBC executives wanted to bury the David episode. They thought it was too heavy, too emotional for reruns. They archived the footage deep in the NBC vaults and planned to never air it again. For years, that 8-minute segment existed only on worn VHS tapes that people had recorded and shared. Younger viewers never saw it. It was becoming lost history until 2002. 24 years after David's death, a Tonight Show retrospective producer was searching through NBC's archives and found the original footage. He showed it to Johnny, who was now retired and living in Malibu. When it ended, he sat in silence for 20 minutes. Then Johnny made one simple request. "It," he said. "Let people see what real courage looks like." The footage was included in a 2003 Johnny Carson retrospective special. A whole new generation discovered David. And the letters started pouring in all over again. Millions of people who weren't even born in 1978 watched an 8-year-old boy say, "Here's Johnny," and understood something profound about bravery and dignity and what it means to truly live. After David died, Johnny Carson quietly donated millions of dollars to children's cancer research. He never publicized it, never took credit, never put his name on buildings. He funded entire hospital wings, research laboratories, and treatment programs. All anonymous, all private, the way Johnny did everything that really mattered. That dignity isn't about being healthy or strong or having a long life ahead of you. Dignity is about being seen as fully human in whatever time you have. David didn't want pity. He didn't want sympathy. He wanted to matter, and Johnny gave him that. In doing so, Johnny showed 35 million Americans that real power isn't fame or money or ratings. Real power is using what you have to give someone else their moment. That photograph Margaret placed in David's hands, the one of Johnny and David backstage, both smiling, now hangs in the Johnny Carson Foundation headquarters in Burbank. Beside it, a small brass plaque reads, "David, 1978, the bravest co-host I ever had. Johnny." Thousands of people see it every year. Most don't know the full story, but they stop, they stare, they feel something they can't quite name, the recognition that something sacred happened here. We all make promises to children, to strangers, to people who need us. Johnny Carson could have said no. He could have protected his ratings and his reputation and his carefully controlled image. But he chose differently. He chose David. And in doing so, he showed us what true greatness actually looks like. Not the fame, not the empire, but the dying boy in the navy blue suit who got to say, "Here's Johnny," and feel completely, beautifully alive. If this story moved you, please hit that like button and subscribe to this channel for more incredible true stories. And let me know in the comments, where in the world are you watching this from? I'd love to hear from you. Thank you for watching.